Hello and welcome to another Facebook Live where we will be talking to authors, esteemed authors of this section of our textbook, Ketogenic, the Science of Therapeutic Carbohydrate Restriction in Human Health. And today we'll be talking about, under the section of medical therapeutics, we're looking at musculoskeletal and immunological aspects. Now, we all know as clinicians, as coaches, even as patients, just how common musculoskeletal conditions are. Mainly, modern medicine thinks about it as age-related wear and tear and unavoidable. While age is a factor for musculoskeletal functional decline, there's also an association with inflammation. And we know that the standard American diet or the processed food diet is associated with inflammation. And we also know, and the research backs this, that therapeutic carbohydrate restriction, on the other hand, shows promise for improving inflammation as well as the microbiome, and obviously has a marvelous role in these conditions that were previously thought to be hopeless conditions. So joining me today, I would like to introduce many people. For many, it is not an introduction. Many of you know Dr. Gary Fettke well. Gary Fettke is an orthopedic surgeon. He practices in Tasmania, Australia. He's got a major interest in preventative medicine and encourages his patients to lose weight before undergoing surgery. Although his specialty is surgery, he believes it's much better to help people avoid surgery, if at all possible. And Gary is focused on the role of diet in the development of diabetes, obesity, and cancer. And he has been speaking out quite profoundly on the combined role of sugar, fructose, refined carbohydrates, and polyunsaturated oils linked together to be behind inflammation and modern disease. Welcome, Dr. Gary Fettke, and thank you so much. And thank you for giving up your sleep to be here.
Well, I don't have to look that beautiful, so that's okay. I'll go. Don't need the beauty sleep.
Well, you've got the right diet, so I think that helps.
I will go back to bed though.
I would like to introduce and welcome Sarah Rice. Sarah is a certified nutrition network medical practitioner. She is also editor and contributor to Ketogenic, the Science of Therapeutic Carbohydrate Restriction in Human Health. She's a member of the Society of Metabolic Health Practitioners. Sarah qualified in the UK as an optometrist and worked in the private practice and for the NHS hospitalized service, and she's now living in Cape Town. And her current focus is on research and curating the references that support clinicians' use of therapeutic carbohydrate restriction to help improve metabolic health as an adjunct to disease management. Welcome, Sarah, and thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much for all of the work that you do, behind the scenes, just curating all those articles for us. Thank you so much, Sarah. So, it's a very exciting time for us here at Nutrition Network because this project that has taken so many years, it's finally, the book's about to be published, and what a book it is. And I want to thank the authors and the editors for the amount of work that has gone into it. As an author and editor myself, I know that you don't want to, I also know that you don't want to get the call back from the editor to edit your work, but I want to thank Sarah and the team of editors for all the work they've done, and Gary for all that you've put in to this marvelous chapter. So I want to start by asking each of you, I'll start with you, Gary. Why is there a need for this textbook? Why should it have been, I mean, in my opinion, it should have been published 2 decades ago. But so then there's an absolutely overwhelming need. What is your view on that?
I think the requirement is that health professionals need a one-stop shop to go back to. I mean, there's an enormous amount of information now on the internet. I think Sarah's job might have been easier 10 years ago when there was less articles written about it, and certainly my early days into it, I had to go searching for that information. And, to be fair, I actually didn't even know the term ketogenic diet hadn't even crossed my pathway at the beginning of my journey into this. And that's about 12, well, arguably it's 30 years ago, but down this specific pathway. So the literature was sparse. It was very much dragging together information from a whole lot of disparate sort of pathways. And I've got lots of stories about how I found this gem or someone sent me a gem, and actually social media opened up a lot of that information. Like one of the things we'll talk about with the information is someone literally on Twitter said, "Have you seen this?" And I went, "No, but thank you very much." And then that was another piece of the jigsaw. And so therefore, but the long and the short of it is we health systems are no longer health systems, they're sickness industries. And they're all unsustainable. It doesn't matter where you are in the world, it's completely unsustainable. And we know the latest results of metabolic health are disastrous. Latest numbers, 93.2% of the world's population, of the US population, extrapolate that around, are metabolically unwell. We're told here in Australia, and it's nowhere else in the world, same in other places, we don't have enough doctors, we don't have enough nurses, we need the governments need to spend more resources. The problem isn't we need more resources, the problem is metabolic health. And literally one answer to that is what fuel we put in our tanks. And as it turns out, the modern diet is highly inflammatory. And that's what we need to be prescribing. That's the only way to turn around the system. And it's fine. You can say to someone, go along and look at this doctor and have a look at, my talk, or look at someone else's talk and find out on YouTube, or this article, or here's a starter sheet. But people want more information, and the amount of work that's gone into putting together ketogenic is that one book. That is a textbook that is completely referenced. It's completely up to date. I mean, I was still having some of my things challenged several weeks ago, which is fine. Great. Here's what article do we need to put into this? And the team, and I have to thank Sarah for making my life hell, saying, can you actually find this other reference, or can you justify that one line, which is fine. That's what it should be. But everything is fully referenced. It's right up to date, and it will be the textbook, and that it will go forward. And it will be the first of many editions, because this field's constantly changing. But not by much, just getting more and more information. The basics are exactly the same though, but the results and the backup and the resource material that's now there for everyone to take. Here, I'll grab this book. Here it is. There'll be something in there that's completely relevant to what they want to be talking about.
Absolutely. So just authenticate something that we've all known for us, all of us on who practice this type of medicine have known for a while, but it actually has pushed us with the eagle-eyed editors reading line by line and saying, where's your reference for this claim? And it pushes you to actually find the references. So I'm really, really pleased and grateful to the team for all the hard work that has gone into this. Sarah, I know, you and I have worked closely, and so, I just want to share that the work that goes as an author, if you write a chapter, that's a sort of the easy part. But then the editors going through line by line, as we've said, and fact checking and making sure that you've got the best papers to support your claim. Your role was huge together with Tamsin and the rest of the editors in making sure that everything that we put out there was authentic. So I know that this is something that's very close to your heart, but would you share with us the need for this textbook?
Yes, I think having everything, as Gary said, in one place is really, it's just essential, and something that you can take, something that can stand alone academically. I remember when I was training as an optometrist, I had this one textbook which I was always looking at. It was called Optometry, and it just had something about everything. And I think that having a textbook that touches all of the areas and having it in one place where, you know, it's substantially referenced, it's been checked, it's been put out by Nutrition Network, which is our sort of highly esteemed learning platform. All of the experts brought together. Obviously, as editors, it's trying to make it cohesive and zooming out and looking at the totality of the textbook and the information that's in it. I think it's really comprehensive. And even when we ran out of word count for certain things like the microbiome, I mean, is a textbook in itself, as you know. And many of the authors couldn't say everything that they wanted to say. So I mean, I think that's important, that, you know, it's not exhaustive in every area, but we've focused on the areas where the strength of evidence is the greatest. And then there's signposting as well to areas like the microbiome, where there's some, you know, mixed studies. There are things we can't say, but there's, I think overall, it's just a much needed, reliable source of information that clinicians can really either use as a springboard for some of the areas where there's maybe less data. For example, you know, neurotrauma, there's maybe a little bit less in that space, but then you've got all of the metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, endocrine, liver, all of the areas where we know the science is really there. So yeah, I mean, it's like a dream to be a part of this project. So it was amazing. So thank you for that opportunity. I do appreciate that.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So Gary, it's quite surprising. I've worked with orthopedic surgeons, and there's this joke that goes around what, you know.
I've heard them all.
What is the function of the heart? It's the organ that pumps the blood to the bones. And no disrespect to my fellow orthopods, but you have really done a deep dive into the territory, you know, biochemical deep dive into root cause. So I'd like you to please share that journey as an orthopod, you know, seeing these chronic patients coming to you and how you found your way, how you came to trying to figure out the root cause of the illnesses.
It's not just chronic disease, it's acute disease.
Mm-hmm.
I'm old enough, 30 odd years doing orthopedic surgery, to realize that things have changed. And what I was seeing 30 years ago is different to what we're seeing now. And metabolic health and the consequences of it are just completely overwhelming the system. We as surgeons are doing too much surgery unnecessarily. And so I've gotten into my hot water with my colleagues by standing up and saying it, but you can justify it by here's the research, here's the science. When we actually address metabolic health, the vast majority of orthopedic conditions improve. I'm not saying cured. I've never said cure, because that, you know, people say, oh, you can't cure osteoarthritis. Well, you can actually decrease the symptomatology of it dramatically, to the point that people still might have bare bone in a joint, but their symptoms have improved to the point they don't need the operation. I actually think we've got medicine completely wrong, but in that I shouldn't be paid for operating. I should be incentivized for not operating. You know, that's really, I should be, you know, I should get maybe a fee for saying, okay, I'm going to do, if we can put off this person's hip replacement by 5 years, then we should get a portion of the surgical fee, which would be infinitely better for the system, but we're not set up for that. So, and I know Sean Baker, who's contributed to the chapter as well. Sean, you know, in a far more numbers-orientated system in the US, got into trouble for not operating enough. Here in Australia, you know, if you don't operate, you don't get paid, but you don't get a hospital pushing down on you. But in my case, it was particularly my public hospital work, and it was particularly around the field of diabetes, that I was that end stage surgeon where people from Northern Tasmania would come to actually get their diabetic foot problems sorted out. And I used to see that as an occasional patient, and then it just became the major component of my public hospital work was deep infections related to diabetes and deep infections related to joint replacements. And arguably most of those deep infected hip and knee replacements have been done on patients who had, if they weren't morbidly obese, then they had significant metabolic health issues. And I was overwhelmed. So the primary situation in orthopedics, because we're very simple characters, is if you go back to root cause. And most of the health, the practitioners that are actually contributing to this book have actually gone back to root cause. And so when you come along, and that's the fascinating thing, it doesn't matter if it's osteoarthritis or mental health issues or neurological conditions or liver disease or the gut microbiome or all the gut pathologies, when we've actually all come back on this one path to the same situation, which is the perils of our modern diet, and particularly around processed food and carbohydrate and sugar. So, and that central role of insulin resistance. And when you come back to that, we've all joined up in the one book from different pathways. So it's literally all roads lead to Rome. Coming back to what Sarah said, that one-off book, my very first textbook that you're supposed to read in orthopedics is a book called Apley's. It's a British book. It's an all-covering book, covers everything. But it's also the last book you read before your fellowship exam. The day before your fellowship exam, you flick through it from cover to cover. And so that what you have as an introduction, by the time you sit your fellowship, you should be able to discuss every single line, every single paragraph in that book. And that's where ketogenic fits in. If you want to learn something about ketogenic in the overview, you will go to ketogenic as your first book. It'll also be the last book you go to when you need something, because you can go to it and it will be referenced to tell you what other articles you can go to. I'm excited because, to me, I think ketogenic is aptly what it is to orthopedics, and orthopedic surgeons, and in fact, many students and doctors right around the world will have heard of Apley's textbook of orthopedics. Full of pictures, because orthopedic surgeons need pictures, but nonetheless, ketogenic doesn't have as many pictures as Apley's does. But that's the big role of it. We have to find a central aspect of health, I think, for the vast majority of people, is metabolic syndrome tied up with insulin resistance. Come back to diet. Therapeutic carbohydrate restriction is the first and easiest step on. But if you need to justify that, that's where ketogenic comes in.
That gave me goosebumps. And, it's so apt what you say there, Gary. But for those who don't know what it's like, I mean, I was privileged enough to be in a position where I had to refer to the orthopedic surgeon. So you see the patient, you realize this patient needs, that this is a diabetic foot, and that means that very likely this patient requires an amputation. I remember as an intern doing orthopedics, I almost passed out standing there, just the realization of what was about to happen, and then being on the other side, and with the bone nibblers, and it's, I'm sorry if I'm sounding graphic, but it really is something that we need to talk about. When you lose your foot, it's quite a macabre, it's quite a gross operation. It's there's nothing lovely about it.
It's an ugly operation. It's a smelly operation.
Yeah.
I used to, my clinic, and I've said this publicly before, it was called Fetke's effed up fructose-free fungating foot folly Fridays. Lots of F's in there. But nonetheless, it was literally, it was palpable. You'd come into the clinic, and I'd say to the students, you will come in here and you will see stuff that you will never see in one clinic for the rest of your life, because it was all literally centralized. And the textbooks don't address diabetic foot pathology. You go to an orthopedic meeting, on even a foot and ankle meeting, it doesn't address diabetic foot pathology. It's quite critical of the system. We are not talking. 90% of the stuff that I'm seeing in the public hospital system is diabetic foot problems. Why aren't we talking about it? Why isn't 90% of our conferences about diabetic foot? And the single biggest tool that I had in improving diabetic feet was prescribing low carb, prescribing some protein into the diet and healthy fats. And I was able, for those people that adopted and families that supported it, that's a simple thing. You don't need a textbook about that. Just put some protein in, stop eating bad food, and you'll get, the number of surgeries that I was able to delay, the number of patients that you could actually improve their outcomes and save their limbs was impossible to, I use the term, once you see it, you can't unsee it. You just, once you see a patient turn it, and that when they get to that point, if their brain's still functioning, and unfortunately, by that point in time, we're ending up with diabetic foot complications. A lot of patients have got end-stage problems with their mental health, their early dementia, their cognitive ability had dropped off. So they needed their family to get into the equation. And I'd say to the family, you have to do this as well, because you are heading down the same path. Without being harsh, they often had the same body habitus as the person who was in front of me. They had the same cultural influences, which is massive on diet, that were of the patients in front of me. And I said, this is your story. This is your pathway, unless you help your mum or your dad or your grandmother, because you all need to do this. And it's as simple as that. It's the greatest tool that I've had in a surgical career to prevent surgery was therapeutic carbohydrate restriction. To the point that, you're putting yourself out of a job, because then you extrapolate that across all of the other things, osteoarthritis, tendinopathy, and issues related to obesity. That's it. It's simple as that. We don't need to operate as much. And here's the textbook, which you can actually then fall back on and say, okay, here's the science behind it, behind the observations.
And it's something that is quite unique, that for that particular patient, when the patient with the diabetic foot, once there's a diabetic foot, it's pretty much there's only one route. I've had many patients who, faced with the decision or faced with this conclusion that you require an amputation, completely, and you must have had loads of those patients who say, I'm not ready, let me go home. And you have, that takes a lot of time and resources explaining to the patient that this could very well be the end. But at the same time, knowing that there's very little that you can do for that particular patient, pivoting to the rest of the family, as you say, and realizing that the need is way before you meet me in that clinic. And that's been my experience as well in the high care unit, where you're seeing patients with end stage diseases and you realize the need is way higher up. Sarah, with the research backing what Gary's talking about, I think most people would accept that for things like diabetic foot, that therapeutic carbohydrate restriction would have a role. Were you surprised by the studies supporting the other topics like osteoarthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, the other musculoskeletal problems, gout? I think gout, we know, is associated with the metabolic syndrome. What was your experience going through the papers? Was this something you were aware of before, or was it something that you became more aware of being involved in editing?
Yeah, so I was aware of quite a lot of connections between autoimmune conditions and the potential for therapeutic carbohydrate restriction to be helpful. I'm surprised, to be honest, there haven't been more studies. I mean, that for me was really one of the surprising things. So, I mean, this short, I really was sort of a very short section here, which was really kind of a segue before Dr. Baker's section. It just really was a signpost to the effect of the microbiome and signposting metabolic syndrome and vitamin D deficiency as being part of the autoimmune sort of picture. And then it was also an opportunity to list those studies that you've mentioned that I hadn't spotted kind of throughout the rest of the text, and I really wanted to sort of get them in. So that was really my little section, which was really signposting those features. I mean, As Gary was saying, there's new evidence, new studies coming out all the time. In fact, just this month's roundup, there was an arthritis study and a review commenting on a case study with therapeutic carbohydrate restriction that had shown benefit. So sadly, that didn't make it into the textbook, but we're seeing this increasing interest, and so it was just a case of trying to get as much into that section as we could. And for me, writing a small overview on the microbiome, metabolic syndrome, and just listing those studies was an opportunity just to kind of get in as many references as we can, which hopefully acts as a signpost. And also just for clinicians out there, please do consider writing up case studies. I know that it's a lot of work, but it would really be helpful to see more in the literature speaking to those issues.
So Sarah, your part in this section was about as you said, gut dysbiosis and autoimmunity. You mentioned that the information, the TCR, the role of therapeutic carbohydrate restriction, it's promising in autoimmune diseases such as type 1 diabetes, celiac disease, Hashimoto's, Crohn's disease, psoriasis, MS, RA, and inclusion body myositis. So when people think about autoimmune disease in general, so if somebody's got something like rheumatoid arthritis, they think it's just my joints. It involves these joints and I need to get the joints better. So what did you find linking the processed food diet, the gut microbiome, and autoimmune diseases?
Yeah, so essentially the microbiome is it's exploding. I mean, just the other day I saw an article that linked again the microbiome to arthritis, and it's not really, I think it's not, the microbiome becomes dysbiotic when we eat a lot of processed food. And I think just keeping things simple, because they haven't really identified, I don't think you can say with clarity exactly what defines the perfect microbiome, because it depends what you're eating. It depends on so many other things. It depends on your metabolic health, environmental issues. So what we need is a degree of homeostasis and a balance between beneficial and harmful bacteria. And when we eat a lot of processed foods, the Western diets with a lot of inflammatory seed oils and a lot of additives, preservatives, then we upset the balance of beneficial bacteria to harmful bacteria. And you can get reduced levels of butyrate producing bacteria, which reduces epithelial integrity and can promote an inflammatory response. We also see that a shift in short-chain fatty acids downregulates the regulatory T cells, and which are anti-inflammatory, and you're moving towards an inflammatory state. And leaky guts can just enable toxic byproducts to create an autoimmune response. So really, therapeutic carbohydrate restriction, it's about removing those preservatives, it's removing the ultra-processed foods. And a lot of the discussion around the short-chain fatty acid production, which is sort of the fermentation of non-digestible carbohydrates, that sort of drives a lot of the conversation around vegetables. But as Sean Baker's section sort of explains, that for some people who have very sensitive guts, it may be that removing plant material is helpful for those people. And I really think it's kind of an individual basis that we can use exclusion protocols and promote gut healing. And then maybe some of those vegetables and other foods can be reintroduced. But therapeutic carbohydrate restriction and removal of processed food is really kind of the mainstay. And that's what we can say with certainty.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Gary, Sarah's touched on autoimmune diseases like RA, but I want to start with osteoarthritis. Now, the common belief behind osteoarthritis is that it's wear and tear. What would you like to, what is the role of processed food diet in osteoarthritis, and why is it not just wear and tear?
Look, I can simplify the chapter down, and it was largely related because I understood. I was trained in the wear and tear concept model, belief. It's ingrained that it's hard to get away from that. But then I started looking at it from the inflammatory aspect, and then I started looking at it from the carbohydrate aspect. And there's a fabulous article which changed everything for me. It came out in 2020 out of China. I always sort of say not everything bad comes out of China in 2020. I'm known for being politically incorrect anyway, but but that was really about the central role of insulin in the role of osteoarthritis, and it's referenced in the article. So in that situation, in osteoarthritis of the knee, under the influence of insulin directly, the inflammatory process went up. And when you reduced the insulin, it went down. The osteoarthritis influence, okay? And I know the authors weren't low carb because the authors said, okay, now we need to target insulin in the management of osteoarthritis. Well, the best way of targeting insulin is to go low carbohydrate, your insulin levels will reduce, and that process changes. But the long and the short of it is, as it turns out, what you find in the cartilage of a joint, of an osteoarthritic joint, you find the end products of glucose metabolism. And you find, when you look at the damage within tendons, you find the end products of glucose metabolism, whether that advanced glycation end products, glycosylated proteins, or disruption of the metalloproteinases, which is a structure which holds everything together. It's always the end products of carbohydrate metabolism. It's not the end products of protein metabolism or fat metabolism. It's not a mineral deficiency. It's not a vitamin D deficiency. At a tissue level, it's the byproducts. There are other factors that contributed to that point, but it's the byproducts. I looked really hard, and this is cognitive, what's the word I'm looking for? Cognitive, where I'm actually looking. I looked really hard at the spine to look at discs of the spine to actually find out that the degenerative diseases associated with the spine around the discs are going to be related to that glucose metabolism. It's not there. However, you get osteoarthritis of the facet joints at the back, and there's still an overall inflammation, and there's a blood supply issue with the spine and the discs. But the long and the short of it, at the tendon level and at the cartilage level, which is a significant majority of musculoskeletal conditions, if we move away from the spine, then it's all you find. It was just fascinating when you start going back. You just find more and more literature which just supports that fact. It's the byproducts of carbohydrate metabolism, and it's an insulin response. And so at a clinical level, the basic scenario is those patients who actually reduce their therapeutic carbohydrate intake, and they reduce their insulin levels, which happens really quickly, get a symptomatic improvement. That's the anecdotal story. That's the N equals 1. But you're quite right, Sarah. It's hard to write that up because we're not being funded by the big industries to write up articles which talk about not operating and not using medications. And here's the other thing about ketogenic. And someone said, "Oh, because you've written a chapter in it, you must be making money." No, okay, zero. So therefore, and again, that's the whole thing. This whole world of low carb is being driven by people who are not in it to make money. They're there to make a difference and give the resources to others. But again, it comes back to, I can't believe how simple orthopedics is at the joint level. It's what we eat. It's what gets through the gut. It's the elevated glucose levels that get through the gut, gets through the system, the insulin resistant state, that actually starts causing that. And it's just drip feeding the damage over a long period of time. And then the wear and tear comes in because the surface has lost its integrity. The tendon has lost its integrity. And I think I briefly mentioned it in the chapter, but the Maillard reaction, which is a cooking term, and it's where the browning of food, particularly, I mean, the classic thing is a piece of bread. If you put it in the toaster and you heat it up, it goes brown. That's the Maillard reaction. And that is when you apply heat, the glucose and the protein combine together, caramelize for a sort of cooking term, and heat up. That same process, when you elevate the blood glucose, you elevate the tissue glucose, the same process is happening in the cartilage, it's happening in the tendons. I use the term that when your blood glucose spikes above normal, you are effectively toasting every bit of tissue. You're toasting your brain, your kidneys, your eyes, your cartilage, your tendons. And when you do that, then we've explained the whole process. It's mediated by glucose at a tissue level, glucose, carbohydrate, the inflammatory process at a blood vessel level, at a mitochondrial level, and it's driven by insulin. And again, this doesn't answer everything, but it's the first step. And when you do that, then you can start changing the pathways and looking further at the gut diversity. But again, comes back to what food we eat. And I've always said fresh, local, and seasonal, Sarah. That really ties in.
Yeah.
You eat fresh, local, seasonal, whole food based on your culture and environment, avoiding added sugar and processed food. That's my mantra. That's it in one sentence. But that covers the gut microbiome because it's giving the locality, but it's giving diversity as well.
Can I just interject slightly there? Because it's the state of nutritional ketosis is also really important because you've got the liver creating ketones, and that also speaks to the gut lining. And in fact, a study was done, David et al., and showed that an animal-based diet, the gut did produce enough butyrate, but the presence of ketones is also very important. When you state of nutritional ketosis, you're not comparing, so the microbiome is obviously going to be different if you're eating an animal-based products, animal-based diets. And being in ketosis, you're running a completely different operating system. So the reason why there's a little signpost in the microbiome is basically because there are studies that show benefit of a ketogenic diet on the microbiome, but there's also studies that are controversial, and they're saying that there's a decrease in diversity. And essentially, so that the signposting is really to say, when you're in nutritional ketosis, all of those elements that perhaps people are examining, what is healthy when you're eating a Western diet, they all kind of fall away, because when you're eating a whole real foods diet, you're running on ketones. You don't need so many short chain fatty acids because your metabolism is completely different. So if we could get everybody just to eat as Gary said, that would just really, and then you can start doing experiments on the microbiome when people are eating real whole ancestral based diets, real foods, then maybe you'll get to somewhere where you can have a more definitive conversation about the role of the microbiome. And that's really where it starts, is just eating those real foods that you were pointing to.
And I think for the vast majority of readers and listeners, they are in areas where you are privileged enough to get access to that food and support your local farmers and farming and agricultural community. We have to understand also that there are vast food deserts, cities which don't have access to fresh food. But there are choices that still can be made which are lower in ultra-processed foods, and particularly carbohydrate, in a society developed and developing nations, which is still dependent on having highly amount. The thing about processed food is it's cheap and it's transportable. And that means, but if you're privileged enough to be able to get fresh, local, seasonal, whole food, it's not just a privilege, it's your duty to actually do that.
Mm.
And that's really where I talk about that regularly, because I think if you've got but what ketogenic is, here's the science behind all of these broad statements that we're saying.
You know,
Here's the reason.
at the root of it, sorry, Gary, and Sarah, it's really simple. What we're saying is really that we never had this mass of, in South Africa, there's, the last time I checked, the wait list was for over 5 years, maybe longer, for knee replacement or for hip replacement. And Gary, I know you mentioned, or you prefer that your patients lose weight before surgery, because obviously that's a better inflammatory condition or healing condition to be in for surgery. And I'm going to ask you about some of your cases who've maybe come back and don't require that operation anymore, that you touched on earlier. But at the core of this is the fact that the modern world cannot cope. Medicine cannot cope with the number of patients requiring this chronic care and acute on chronic care. And, just the patient who comes in with osteoarthritis can be really sick. Then you take away their mobility. They have, you're making sure that their sarcopenia accelerates. So they're even less metabolically healthy because they're no longer as mobile as they could be. And with the number of people who have to wait, it's a no-win situation. So what we're really saying is, we used to eat a certain way. It was real food. We never checked ketones. We never worried about our level of fructose and how much fat we had in our liver and the state of our glycocalyx, of our endothelium, and all of that. But all of these chronic diseases are exploding, and we're not keeping up. So when you talk about the level of ketones, I'm just trying to translate for somebody who, some people find it really overwhelming, especially people in the food deserts, as you mentioned, Gary. Not everybody has access to CGMs or even just, glucometers. So it boils down to eat real food that has been touched as little as possible. If you can grow it in your garden, if you can support your local farmer, with as little, marinade sauce and preservatives and glyphosates as possible. But Gary, I want to ask you about that, the wait list for the orthopedic, those operations that can wait, not those that can't wait, like the acute diabetic foots, but the feet, but the hip replacement, the knee replacement, all of those things. What's your experience dealing with just the numbers of people who are waiting, and then those who you put on a diet of therapeutic carbohydrate restriction?
Well, I've traditionally not put people on the waiting list until I think they're desperate. So I kept my waiting list down until people literally came hobbling through the door and couldn't walk. And some people thought, some of my colleagues thought I was a bit harsh with that. I know enough patients went and saw other people but I also had a whole lot of patients that come to see me saying, I really don't want the operation. I heard you're going to be really hard on me and make me change my lifestyle before I do it. I thought that was really fascinating. I had a choice of several surgeons to go to, but they came to me because I was going to be forcing them. And you can't stop people you can't force someone to eat one way or another way. I was literally giving them firm options of saying, when you get to this goal, and it didn't have to be that they had to lose weight, but they needed to adopt a lifestyle change. So, 30 years ago, I wouldn't operate on smokers because I knew that the outcomes were poor, and there was enough early literature around to support that. It was very controversial 30, 35 years ago to not operate on smokers. But now that's common. That's actually, all right, don't have, major surgery, don't have major, plastic surgery, heart surgery, any major surgery if you're a smoker, because the outcomes are poorer. And we've had that data. If you go looking for it, as Sarah would know, there are papers that go back and say that support this whole stand of therapeutic carbohydrate restriction. But they were few and far between when I started that journey, and there's more that support that now. it just keeps coming back to the fact that we, as you've said, it's unsustainable. And whether or not it's a 5-year waiting list at one hospital or 10 years at another one, or a year or whatever, I spoke to someone just the other day, and he works in a different town or different city here in Tasmania. And his patients, their average BMI is now 40 that he's doing joint replacement on. Now, to me, that's the surgery is harder, and it's not talking about just the surgeon, it's for the patient, the whole recovery process. But I've done talks on this topic. The complications of operating on someone with obesity and super obesity are far greater and avoidable than operating on someone who is of normal weight or slightly overweight with a good metabolic health scenario. And I use the argument, we use perioperative antibiotics, we use sterile theatres, we wash the wound, you wash the skin beforehand, it's all prepped and draped. You use theatres with a sterile processing, whether it's called positive pressure theatres, or you might see surgeons in spacesuits. If you sum up all of those things are done to reduce the risks of surgery, all of those combined are still less than the risks of operating on someone with super obesity. Yet we do all this preventable stuff with our surgery, but the biggest thing which is going to determine outcome, function, complications, infection, longevity of a joint replacement, is the patient's weight. Not whether or not so I'd be sued if I didn't wash my hands before operating. I'd be sued if I literally didn't use perioperative antibiotics. I'd be sued if I spat in the wound. I know it sounds gross. Yet we're not being sued by operating on a patient who has got a reversible condition. And that improvement in metabolic health can happen literally, as you know, within weeks. And like the bariatric surgeons, before they do bariatric surgery, I think this is always laughable. I've had this debate with bariatric surgeons. The treatment they put patients on before doing the bariatric surgery is they put them on a therapeutic carbohydrate restriction for 6 weeks to shrink the liver down. So that it can improve access and improve the liver and improve the metabolic health and their outcomes. And I've said, okay, well, you've done it for 6 weeks. Why don't you do it for another 6 weeks, and then another 6 weeks, another 6 weeks? And guess what? They don't make any money.
Yeah.
I know that's harsh, but again, I'm not. And Rob Sires is a bariatric surgeon, and as it's for his patients that have done therapeutic carbohydrate restriction and been supported in that, and motivated and held accountable. They still might need it, but he's reduced his patient population down, and he's improved his patient outcomes dramatically by incorporating this as a tool both pre-surgery and post-surgery. And the same thing is, when patients say they're going to lose weight after a knee replacement, we've got lots of data on that. So they don't. The vast majority of people don't lose weight. People say, I can't get out and exercise. You mentioned those people, once you develop an osteoarthritic joint and you become less mobile, they don't get out as much, they don't exercise as much, they don't get as much vitamin D exposure. They're then dependent on people bringing food to them, which all comes back to the gut microbiome. We're all completely interrelated, because inflammation, all of this doesn't just affect the cartilage, it's affecting the gut, the mental state, mobility, economically, the whole process. It's all just completely tied up. So we're all under the one roof in this book. Sorry,
I think that's also something that the textbook ties together. Maybe if you could weave a thread through the whole thing, it would be insulin resistance. And I think in the hospital community, I mean, I've used to work for the NHS, so everybody is in their silo, and it's just so difficult to get relationships between those. And the textbook really just demonstrates that the causative factors, the insulin resistance and inflammation, are across the board of all of these chronic diseases. So, I mean, just having everything also in one book, can people see, will it help in that conversation between all the departments? Will it help move things forward in that way? So, we can look at addressing the food that we're eating, making good quality food accessible to even the lowest socioeconomic groups. I mean, that's obviously a priority, and but Eat Better South Africa are sort of leading the way there. Yeah, to me, that's also a really important feature of the textbook, is it does just demonstrate this underlying principle, causative factor across all of these domains.
Sarah, you talk about the silos. I completely agree. But what we as healthcare professionals in our silos have forgotten, that our first degrees were all across general medicine and surgery, and all of our degrees were based on biochemistry. And the vast majority of us in those silos now have just forgotten that we've all got the first degree, and we've also forgotten that basic biochemistry. And that's because myself, as you know, Tim is a good friend. We've gotten into trouble with the system because we moved outside of our silos. But the fact is, but this is the great thing about being a surgeon and arrogant. We were right to do it. So you got to have that arrogance as a surgeon. But and I just knew that I was right. Yeah. And so the more obstacles coming up against us were saying that we were wrong. We go, no, this is biochemistry. I've relearnt biochemistry. I still don't know. It's constantly. I'll never know it all. But I've had to relearn biochemistry. You go back to the root cause. You go back to the basics. I often say, what happens inside a cell is science, it's biochemistry. What happens inside the body is science, it's biochemistry. What happens outside of the cell and outside of the body is politics and money and education and ideology. And that's been the fascinating thing, because this book is not, as far as I can work out, and I haven't read every chapter, is not about the politics and the ideology and the finances and the education. This is about, here's the science.
Absolutely. And it's not about anecdotes either. It's not about anecdotal case studies at all. It's about, as you say, and that was the reason behind the structure of the book. When we put the book together, it is about gaining the trust of the medical discipline. Because as you say, Gary, we all come into this going through anatomy, physiology, biochemistry. Everyone's done Ganong or Guyton and all of these textbooks that have a particular format. And that was the reason that we structured the chapters in that way, to go back to that level of trust that you can fact check with your own copy that you've got from medical school days, or get a new copy, and you'll see that we're not talking about anything, we haven't made up anything. And all of the clinical stuff is backed by science. And that was the important part of, I think the heart behind the book was, at the root of all of this is the patient. At the root of all of this is a clinician that is desperate to have a healthy patient. And, as a clinician, for me, seeing that patient come back, not just with a sort of a scale victory, but a non-scale victory. I was able to get off the chair by myself. I woke up this morning and I don't have hip pain. I've had doctors as patients who, I don't believe this has anything to do with diet, but let's just see. And then lo and behold, they go off the ketogenic diet and they wake up with excruciating joint pain. So it's really something that I think will prove itself, as just looking at the format and paging through the chapters gives you such a sense of comfort and trust, and you can fact check it yourself. But Sarah, we're almost out of time, so I want to ask you. You mentioned about removal of plants, so basically animal-based diets and the role in healing the gut and thereby improving autoimmune conditions. Do you want to just touch touch on that, because, the background is that there are a lot of people who adopt the ketogenic diet and eat seeds and plants and nuts and are well from other conditions, improve, but suddenly flare in, relation to, gut-related issues or eczema or joint-related issues. And then they have improvement by removing those materials either for the short term or for the long term. What does the evidence show? You did mention that the microbiome studies, they're a bit controversial. I think that those studies just need to be looked at a little bit later. Most of the studies on microbiome are just too short, the samples that they took. So when you look at those few papers out there that show more times passed with these patients being on a ketogenic diet, then the results are even better. But what evidence have you found in the literature for improvement of gut on an animal-based diet?
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Baker's really the expert there. And really, when I looked at the microbiome, I was really signposting just for completeness, the fact that there's some controversy in some of the studies. And so not to discount zero carbohydrate exclusion protocols based on the fact that we do see a variation in commentary on the microbiome when animal-based versus plant-based. So I really just wanted to signpost the fact that when you are not eating carbohydrates, and then perhaps you go into ketosis, then that allows gut healing, and you can't talk about the microbiome in the same way when you're not eating plant material. I know that in his section he touches on plant toxicity. I think that I don't know that arrives by itself. We're living in a food environment which is high in ultra-processed foods, and perhaps when we are combining those ultra-processed foods and plants that certain people are sensitive to, then you maybe get a degree of gut dysbiosis. And when you go into a zero carbohydrate diet and you go into nutritional ketosis, that promotes healing. That's from there's not a lot of studies that talk about zero carbohydrate diets. We see that you can put SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, into remission using a zero carbohydrate diet. I think there's 1 or 2 case studies which demonstrate that. And obviously that in of itself promotes gut healing and a eubiotic, movement in a eubiotic direction. And I think that, Dr. Baker would be the expert in his clinical evidence, that he's a clinical experience. And I think for me, that's always the tension. You have your clinical experience and you have what do the papers show. And then there are certain points in the journey where we're trying to reconcile those two. We're looking at what the literature says and we're looking at clinical experience, and we're trying to walk the two together. So clearly, Dr. Baker has shown, a lot of success adopting a zero carbohydrate approach, and I think we just haven't untangled maybe all the reasons why, and maybe he would have been able to speak to that better.
As Gary said, I know I'm right. And time will tell, because those papers will come out. I've had experience as a clinician with patients with joint issues, with not just gout, but inflammatory joint issues, with severe eczema, with chronic fatigue syndrome. And it is a very difficult road to travel with your patient, because there is no one map that fits one particular patient. And it's about that sort of individualized therapy, and figuring out what it is that causes disease in the gut. As you said, there's so many different components. Could it be the glyphosates? Could it be the preservatives? Could it be the fact, the ultra processedness of the food?
I think sorry, also just briefly, things like your birth history and what microbiome you have seeded just actually puts you on the back foot potentially. So and the epigenetics and what microbiome you start with, and then you have reduced tolerance. And I think that the eubiotic gut has an increased tolerance, and the dysbiotic gut has a decreased tolerance. And there are so many factors that play into that it's really tricky.
So in closing, Dr. Gary Fettke, there may be some patients watching who or watch this later who are feeling hopeless over morbidly obese, with joint issues, who are not getting maybe an OA hip or knee. What advice do you have for them, or for any clinician who is involved in this field? What advice do you have, seeing the successes that you've seen in your practice?
I'll come back to your discussion around accessibility. Not everyone has access to all the blood tests, or the complex ways that you can measure ketones or continuous glucose monitors. What everyone does have access is to, which is one of my favorite questions, how do you feel? Mm-hmm. And waist circumference. You don't even need a tape measure. You just have a string which put around it, literally. Or more importantly, how do your clothes fit? I've had patients come in and abuse me for saying, well, you owe me a new wardrobe. And I say, but you owe me your life back. That sort of, I actually think it's incredibly simple. I always say that orthopedic surgeons, to give you some justice, orthopedic surgeons are simple people made, simple surgery made difficult by simple surgeons. And it really is that simple. Follow the pathway of what fuel you put in the system. As it turns out, the definition of avoiding ultra-processed foods is a ketogenic diet. And when you ask the patient to do that and support them in that and keep them accountable, whether or not we're all patients and we're all individuals. And by the way, a lot of us, we're doctors as well. But it's really simple. Pay attention to that. Metabolic health will improve. It may improve a little, it may improve a lot. And the science behind it is expanding. The papers are increasing, and ketogenic's a great start to actually getting across that.
Thank you so much. I love that. How do you feel? It's the connection that we've lost with ourselves, and that many people don't realize how well they feel once they remove, as you said, Sarah, just remove the toxin. Once you remove that toxin, you suddenly...
that's another simple thing that you can ask patients to do. I ask if I'm helping someone, when you eat a meal, you write down how it made your stomach feel. I don't think your stomach should be hurting. It shouldn't, just take note. How do you feel? How did you feel after a week? Write down those non-scale victories. Remember how you felt when you ate different foods, and take it forward from there.
People forget all the little non-scale victories. I promised Gary we wouldn't keep him too long. Any closing comments from you, Sarah? I mean, you've gotten an overview of the whole textbook. Any closing comments for other patients or practitioners who are as yet unsure of this therapeutic carbohydrate restriction thing?
I think that the textbook demonstrates that, there's a lot of evidence. I think it will be helpful to clinicians. I think that it's accessible for curious clinicians and more experienced clinicians across the board. So yeah, I'm really excited for what it can do to help just further the cause and just promoting real food. Yeah.
Thank you so much to all of you joining us on this Facebook Live. And thank you so much to Dr. Gary Fettke for giving up his sleep and for joining us and sharing all of his knowledge with us. And thank you to Sarah Rice. And stay tuned. We'll be doing more author interviews over the next couple of days. Thanks so much, guys. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.